Good day, students. We now come back to Lecture 7 of Ecology. I'm Professor Rita Yam. Today, we're going to continue to talk about community structure. To begin with the lecture content for today, I would like to have a brief summary of what we have talked about last week about the two main aspects for community structure. First of all, succession. Succession refers to the temporal variation of community structure. So this indicates the process of directional change in the communities over time. And this involves the community structure with different components of the biodiversity change through a series of zero stages towards a climax community that remains relatively stable on an ecological time scale. So the time involved in successional change could be long. And then the second major aspect for community structure would be diversity. Diversity refers to the spatial variation of community structure. So this usually refers to what we say about the number of species occur in a community or in a region, which may be weighed by their relative abundance or ecological importance. So we always want to note about why many taxonomic groups of different species exist together in such a conformity, forming our healthy or unhealthy ecosystems. So this is particular important information for conservation and ecological restoration. Okay, so we're going to continue to talk about succession first for today's lecture. So after we look at the case studies of the Mount St. Helens volcanic eruption and the succession after the volcanic eruption, you should already build up some concept about succession. And here I would like to introduce the one important hypothesis for succession, which is called monoclinics hypothesis. 我们刚讲到一个 Mount St. Helens 火山爆发这个案例之后呢，现在我们来看一个演替上很重要的一个假说叫做单一巅峰群聚的一个假说 So this hypothesis states about the biological community. They are highly integrated superorganisms that develop through a progressive gradual process of succession to a single endpoint in a given area under particular climates. So in this case, this hypothesis highlight one importance is the members from that community are highly bound together, like our superorganism, and they during the process of succession they change progressively and via particular step, and towards a single endpoint. So single one endpoint, and this is referred to mono. Mono means one, 单一的结果, and this single endpoint with a particular reference to the climate condition. So it has another name called climatic climax. So climatic climax, this is the endpoint for community structures at the end of successional process. So remember I told you there are three key factors affecting the succession: water, land, and climate. So when we focus on the endpoint of the succession, we need to highlight the importance of climate, water, and land, because they would have different effect on the successional process and the successional endpoint. So these three factors would govern the plant and animal at the pioneer stage and the process during succession. Remember at the beginning I have a question to you. When we talk about the primary succession and secondary succession, primary succession refers to the situation occur in new sterile area, and secondary succession refers to the succession recovery from the disturbed site. primary succession 它是一级演替 ，secondary succession 它是二级演替的。那两个 succession 它的差异性呢，是在于它们一个演替前跟后，就是干扰发生前跟演替发生的终点，它们的植物的组成的植物群居的组成的有没有相同 ？OK。So for primary succession, it occurs in new sterile area, completely new system. Okay, so this is disrupted by the severe factor, for example, fire, volcanic activity. It will kill all the plant and all the seeds, okay, in the soil. So after the disturbance, there is no seed remain in the soil, and all plant developed after the disturbance would be different from before the disturbance. Okay. For secondary succession, there are factors starting the succession, including flood or glaciation. They did not disturb the seed bank in the soil. Okay. So after the disturbance, there are same set of seeds would germinate after the disturbance. So the plant community composition would be similar before disturbance. OK， 那我们比较一级跟二级演替的时候呢，主要的差异是在于它们受干扰程度的、受干扰前后的植物群聚的结构相似度哦。那如果它是一级演替的话，它就是发生一些比较剧烈的干扰，像是火灾或是一个火山的火山爆发的影响。它会把土壤里面的植物的种子全部烧光，然后导致干扰后重新演替的植物相会跟本来的完全不一样。但是二级演替呢，它是一个恢复的过程，当然就是一些干扰是比较没有那么破坏性的，像是洪灾或是冰封这样。那这样它泥土里面还存有是干扰前一样的种子那些种子会在干扰后重新发芽成长。所以干扰后跟前的植物相会是一样的。那所以我们可以通过检查植物相在干扰前后的相似程度，跟造成干扰的因子到底是破坏性还是非破坏性，来确定我们现在是一级还是二级演替。Okay, so to confirm whether we are studying a primary or secondary succession, we can either checking the plant community structure before and after the disturbance, and the factor causing the succession, okay, whether they are destructive factor like the fire or volcanic activities, or the non-destructive factor like the flood and glaciation. Okay, so we have a question here for is succession reversible? Here, very clear, succession is generally not reversible because they are directional or cyclic process unless the disturbance keep on happening. Okay, so for the secondary succession, then first primary succession major difference would related to the seed bank. Okay, so here when we study the succession, there are four important models. Okay, very important in characterizing the successional mechanism. If you remember, here there are 5 key points for us to understand succession. The mechanism driving the change in community and the effect of early species on later species both are important factors for us to understand the succession. And this 4 succession model would be important in identifying the mechanism of succession and the effect of early species on later species in the successional process. Okay, so I'm going to introduce to you this 4 successional model. The first one is facilitation model, 促进模型. Okay, this model suggests that species replace one another at an orderly, predictable sequence. Okay, at each stage, the early species modify the environment to make it less suitable for themselves and more suitable for the others. Okay, so the early species in generally would facilitate the arrival of later species by improving the environment. 促进模型呢，它在主要是说 先到的物种，它其实会跟那个后来的物种之间是有一个顺序的关系。先到的物种呢的忍耐力比较强，后来的物种呢是比较需要一些比较好的环境，所以先到的物种呢，它可以忍耐不好的环境，改善不好的环境。当环境改善到好的时候呢，就不再适合那些忍耐力很高的生物了。那呢，就给后来的一些只适应好环境的物种就来了。所以呢，是前面的物种改善环境，给后面的物种来享受好的环境。OK， 这个就是促进模型。So for a facilitation model, is the early species improve the environment, and then to facilitate the later species. Okay, so early species have benefit to the later species. Okay, and second model, inhibition model, 抑制模型. Okay, in this model, it states that the initial floristic composition depend on who get to the area first. Okay, no matter for the tolerance ability, and the species replacement not necessarily orderly, no order, and each species exclude and suppress any new colonists, and it is more individualistic and less predictable because it related to the principle of first come, first occupy, and the community not always converging towards the climatic climax, and usually inhibition model occur in the severe environment. Okay. 这个抑制模型呢，通常是发生在一些比较恶劣的环境、比较差的环境条件。好，它讲求的话，前面先到的物种不会改善环境，不会为后面的物种改善环境。原则上都是先到先赢，先来的占地为王，后来的呢，它就会被先来的去排除它。所以呢，谁先到，谁就是赢到最后。
The first successional model, which is tolerance model, 忍耐模型. In this model, the presence of early succession species is not essential, so there would be no pioneer species involved in this tolerance model. Any species can start the succession. The species which is more tolerant to the limiting factor would replace the other. So the more tolerant species would be the one who can colonize the environment. And the competitive superior species, they will become predominant in the climax community. So in this model, those species with stronger competitivities and stronger tolerance would be the winner of this model. Okay? The fourth model, which is the random colonization model, or you can say the null model. So this is a relatively random model for colonization and succession. In Mandarin, we call it 随机脱脂模型. And for this type of succession, only chance survival of different species occur. So no facilitation, no inhibition, no pioneer species. So no interspecies competition involved. It can move in any direction. So for this type of model, it's completely random, and there would be no track for prediction, and it would be the most complicated model for us to understand and predict. Okay, after we just learned about the four types of succession model, we have a question. So what is the major difference among the four successional model? So the answer is very clear, which is the establishment mechanism. Okay, so it would highlight the difference of these four types of successional models. Now we're going to look at our first case studies for today, which is about Surtsey Volcanic Island. Surtsey Volcanic Island located in Iceland. There is a primary succession occur on this island, and this island is relatively young and new, formed after an underwater volcanic eruption in 1963. The present size of this island is 2.8 square kilometer, which is only half of its original size due to steady erosion. So originally, the size of this island is bigger, but there is continuous erosion of around the island, the coastline of the island. So therefore, it is shrinking in size. And there is a slow initial colonization because of the difficult nutrient condition in volcanic soil. Remember the case for the Mount St. Helens after the volcanic eruption, because all the nutrient has been burned out and evaporate because of the high temperature of lava. Okay, and there is a very difficult condition for any species to establish in this type of volcanic soil environment. But after the late 1970s, there is a population of gulls start colonizing the island, and this accelerates the plant colonization by two factors. First of all, the gulls, 海鸥就是一些海鸟 brought seeds from various islands onto the Jersey Island. And the second factor is the gulls transfer energy from the sea to the land in their droppings. So when these gulls, they come to nest on the Jersey Island, they will have the droppings, okay, left on the island. And the dropping is actually produced after the seagull when they after they feed on the fish in the sea around the area, and then they can bring the nutrient, transferring the nutrient from the fish to the island through their droppings. Okay, so we can see in this environment, after the facilitation by the gulls activity, the nutrient of the soil increase slowly. With the seeds brought from the gulls onto the island, the plant diversity slightly increase through years. So we can see from this figure, from 1965, which was the time just after the volcanic eruption when the island was first formed, and then to year 2005, the number of species on the island increased slowly, okay, and keep increasing. So this is very typical succession pattern in a volcanic soil environment. Okay, you may need to think about which type of succession model, okay, refer to this case occur in the Jersey Island. Think about this. Movie 3, for the succession lecture, we're going to look at the documentary about the birth of the volcanic island, the Jersey Island. So there's lots of important information about how the successional change occur on this interesting volcanic island after the underwater volcanic eruption. Now, we're going to look at our second case studies about the Lake Michigan sand dune succession.
Lake Michigan is one of the lakes from the Great Lakes. Okay, we talked about the Great Lakes and the sea lamprey last week. Lake Michigan is one lake of the Great Lakes. 我们那个 Great Lakes 有5个大湖，对不对？ Lake Michigan 是其中一个大湖。OK， 这个湖很大很大，很大很大，所以呢，它好像海一样大，你看不到对岸。所以你看到这个照片，好像一个波浪一样啊，它不是海浪，它是风吹的。So if you look at the picture on the right hand side, as the lake is really big. So there's even waves, but this is not sea waves. This is produced by the wind action, very windy. Okay, so the sand dune, satchel. Okay, this is formed by sand. Okay, it's particular landscape structure， 它是一个很特别的地形的一个形成哦。那我们在台湾可能你有去过野柳，那是一个也是一些石头沙被风吹出来风化的形状。那 Michigan 呢，它有个沙丘就是沙被风吹出来的一个特别的地景结构。Okay, and the formation of sand dune can range between several thousand years to several 10 years。它其实是从几十年到几千年呢，上万年也有的这些沙丘，因为很久之前已经在陆续形成了。Okay, so these dunes classified as the new ideal system for studying the plant succession. Okay, remember that I mentioned to you there are 3 factors are very important in characterizing the successional mechanism and the pattern, including the land, water, and the climate. For sand dune, they are same for the initial substrate, same sand, and climate, relief, and the water availability and the nutrient content are completely the same because they are formed in the same area, Lake Michigan. Also, there are same source of plant and animal, same flower and fauna in the area. So this plant and animal would be important in participate the successional process and shaping the successional process. 沙丘呢是被科学家定义成为一个很适合的理想的一个系统，作为研究植物的演替的。因为我们刚刚提过了3个因子，对于演替非常重要：气候、水跟土地，对吧？那这沙丘呢，它是同样的材料，就是沙，气候、陆地、水分养分都是一模一样的，因为都是来自同一个 Lake Michigan 那个墨西哥湖的湖区，一样的形状一样的动物跟植物动物跟植物呢，它是参与演替的一些生物，还有去塑形演替的一些很重要的生物，所以都一模一样。所以我们可以通过比较不同年岁的沙丘刚刚说几千岁、几十岁都有的，就可以去了解这个沙丘的演化。因为我们其实是不可能有几千岁去看这个沙丘从小长到大的嘛，但是我们可以比较不同岁数的沙丘去了解这个沙丘的演替。Okay, so that we can compare the sand dune of different ages, okay, to understand the successional process, because this is impossible for us to follow the change of the successional change of sand dune, okay, from early age to old age, because we don't have such a long life for several thousand years. Okay, so for the area, the only disturbance refer to selective logging in 19th century and wildfires. Okay, 在这个区域里面呢，主要有发生过的人为干扰呢是2个。第一个呢是19世纪的时候有一个伐木第二呢就是有山火的发生就是要开伐田地的时候有一些被烧过的一个失控的一个事情，所以有很多植物被火烧过。Okay.
Movie 4. This is a documentary about the plant successions of the dunes along the Great Lakes coast.
Imagine the Great Lakes 10,000 years ago, the land gradually beginning to recover from the ravages of repeated glaciation events. Life returned slowly at first, but it started to build as the intersection of biology and geology gave birth to ephemeral landscapes with ephemeral plant communities growing upon them. Dunes is the story of ecological succession. In fact, here at the tip of Lake Michigan is where the idea of succession really started to take shape. As the glaciers retreated, they exposed a barren landscape of rock and water. Streams and rivers slowly dumped their sandy contents into the lake, and wave action deposited it upon the shores. Once exposed, ceaseless winds piled these sands into hills called dunes. These sandy dunes invited only the hardiest of plants to put down their roots, but that is all it takes. Lakes are by no means stable ecosystems. They change. Even with its immense size, Lake Michigan is no exception to this. Because the shoreline has been gradually retreating over time, we see varying ages of sand dune communities only a few miles offshore. On a single stretch of trail, a hiker can travel back in time thousands of years.
Welcome everyone. We're here at the tip of Lake Michigan, and we're here to tell the story of succession. How one ecological community makes way for another. And our story is going to start here at the beach. And it begins with, well, that right over there. Come join me. Everything we're going to cover today starts with this species right here. This is called marram grass, and it is one of the most important dune building plants in this entire ecosystem. You can find this species growing everywhere from the Atlantic coast, throughout the Great Lakes, and all the way to the Pacific. It is a super resilient grass species. Not only is it very tough to avoid being blasted by sand and cut down before it has a chance to reproduce, it also handles being buried by sand very well. As winds whip off the shoreline, they bring in tons of sand and pile it up, and this plant just gradually gets buried, buried, and buried, but it just keeps growing and growing and growing. This can reach stem lengths of up to 20 feet or more in some of the deeper early successional dune communities. What's more, this very fibrous root system is what's actually building the dunes. As you can see here, what's eroded out a little bit is still holding on to tiny grains of sands. It is remarkable how resilient this plant is, and it's one we owe, again, the existence of this entire ecosystem too. So let's move on and see what this sets the stage for.
The early dunes. These are the youngest plant communities. This stretch of shoreline offers some of the harshest conditions to plant life. Anything surviving here must have a hardy disposition.
So here we are on the leeward side of the dune. You can tell things are already starting to look a little bit different. This area is slightly more sheltered from the brunt force of the winds ripping off of Lake Michigan over there. And that changes the types of vegetation that can establish. The grass that you see here is mostly little blue stem, and that's not a dune builder per se, but it's helping that successional process along. What it does is it gets established after certain earlier successional species set the stage, and its roots grow deep down into the sand, further stabilizing the dune and allowing other plants to also establish. Not only does it cut back erosion, but as it dies back, it starts putting organic material into the soils and changing that sandy, nutrient-poor conditions into conditions in which other plants can establish. So with any luck, we'll find some plants that are easily accessible that we can look at and talk a little bit more about this leeward side of the dune community. Newer dunes are extremely dynamic habitats, and I mean extremely dynamic. They're constantly shifting and changing as the winds blow them around, and any plant that has to grow there is either very tough or lives a very short life cycle, and here's one of those right here. This tiny little mustard is the sandcress, and it is a very short-lived either perennial or usually a biennial, meaning it grows vegetatively its first year, flowers, set seeds, and dies the second year. It just can't stick around on the landscape long enough, so it relies on its seed bank to carry on the next generation from year to year to year. Nonetheless, it's a beautiful little plant and surprisingly delicate for an area that's getting sandblasted constantly. I'm always amazed by the plant communities you'll find in these early dune successional habitats. If a plant has any hope of sticking around for a longer period of time in these early successional dune habitats, they also have to be tough. And two great examples of that are right here in front of me. This is the yellow-flowered puccoon, a member of the borage family. It's got a wonderful aroma, and just what's not to love about these bright yellow tubular flowers? Gorgeous plant, great for pollinators, extremely tolerant to drought, And on the right here, we have wormwood, a cousin of the sagebrush. It's actually a member of the aster family, which isn't readily apparent, but again, both of these plants are supremely adapted to life here in these sandy soils. If you look, they've got hairy, narrow leaves, which reduces water loss. Their taproots go deep down, hold on to the soil, and access water, even though it doesn't stick around very long. And just gorgeous plants overall. So nice to see them. And these aren't the only drought-tolerant plants by a long shot in this ecosystem. In fact, I'm looking around here and I could see more. Let's go look at some over here. Now, what could be more drought-tolerant than a prickly pear? Now, some of you may be surprised to see a cactus living on the shores of the Great Lakes, but nonetheless, it is supremely adapted to these dune-like conditions. Despite there being a huge body of fresh water and plenty of rain, these are drought-prone soils, and you don't get more drought-tolerant than a cactus. As you can see, these are doing really well here. They're surviving the regular burns that come through this area, and they're even getting ready to flower. In a few short weeks, these will be alive with insects. Such a beautiful plant. Now, another member of these sort of mid-level successional species that might surprise you is this one right here. This is the pasture or Carolina rose. It is one of our native rose species, and as you can see, roses look vastly different when you're not breeding them for multiple petals. It kind of has this low ambling growth habit, probably to keep it out of the way of the wind, keep its center of gravity kind of low so it's not getting disturbed too much, but it's a gorgeous little plant, has a wonderful aroma, and it's just thriving out here. I can look about the landscape and see tons of it, and many of them have rose hips chock full of seeds, so it's doing quite well in this sort of mid-successional dune habitat. Great find.
The mid-dunes. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that succession is necessarily predictable. The process certainly is, in most cases. However, it's the players that change.
This right here is one of the most exciting botanical finds in the Lakeshore Dunes community. This is the critically endangered pitcher's thistle. Now, life has not been very good for this plant ever since humans started settling these shores. It's got a weird lifespan of about 3 to 8 years before it actually flowers, and then after it flowers, it dies, which means it only gets one shot at reproducing. Now, it's adapted to this highly disturbance-prone habitat, but too much disturbance, such as trampling or a lack of the erosive forces that keep competition to a minimum, will actually remove this plant from the landscape. And again, it's not doing very well anywhere in its range, although Lake Michigan does provide one of the last strongholds for this plant. Now, the sad part is as the populations get smaller, their seeds become more and more vulnerable to things like finches, which eat them. If there was a lot of plants, a little bit of seed predators, not that big of an issue. But as their populations continue to decline, seed predators become more and more of a pest. For now, we're going to enjoy this plant from afar. Getting too close to it would be really detrimental to its health. And with any luck, a dedicated team of restoration practitioners will be saving seeds and reintroducing new plants across the habitats of this great lakeshore community. Now, every once in a while, Mother Nature hits the reset button on the succession process, and this is a really good example of that. This is what we call a blowout, and it's specific to sandy habitats, especially dunes. Something caused an erosion event here, and you get a steep slope that the wind can then come in and pick up more sand and just creates a lot of erosion. As you can see, a lot of the grasses are the early successional species that, again, can adapt really well to those hyper-disturbed environments. But even so, you still have plenty of shrubs along the rim holding on to it, and even some species are well adapted specifically to these blowouts. They have harder tissues to keep from being sand blown. It's a pretty remarkable microclimate that some species do incredibly well in. So here we have 3 common woody species that you're going to find on these mid-successional dune communities. We have the cottonwood here, down below we have a juniper, and right here we have one of my personal favorites, the wafer ash. It is not actually an ash, but a member of the citrus family, and it is a host for the giant swallowtail butterfly. Now, this species is really great because, again, its roots get down, they hold on to the sand, and it provides a lot of detritus to help build up those organic layers. The juniper down below here provides a lot of berry-like cones for different kinds of birds, but it also is a dune stabilizer. It grows on top and keeps erosion, especially from wind and rain, from taking away the dune sands before anything else can establish. And of course the cottonwood. Now this tree is super early successional because its seeds simply cannot germinate without sunlight. So this likes to grow in sheltered areas where enough sun gets down and warms the sand and allows its seeds to germinate. But once it gets going, it's a fast growing tree and it's really prone to disturbance habitats. Little bits of branches can break off, land into the sand, and actually root and create a whole new tree. It's a pretty remarkable species and one that deserves a lot more respect than it gets. Now as we move farther back from the lakeshore, it's like we're going back in time. And as you can see behind me, as you get older and older dunes, you get more and more vegetation. Those early successional habitats grade into later successional habitats like we saw on the leeward side of the dune, and as more and more vegetation starts to build up, the microclimates start becoming more and more favorable to a wider array of species. Trees like oaks, tilia, and even cottonwoods can become established, and they set down the roots and really hold on to that soil. And again, all of their detritus, from the leaves to the twigs, adds more and more organic layers to the soil itself, allowing more and more plants to become established. Research has found that actually trees initiate the succession process, allowing shrubs to get a root hold and then further grading the dunes into more of a forested habitat like you see behind me. But down here you get more of the scrubby stuff mixed with a lot of herbaceous vegetation. And this is where things really start to look more and more like a forested ecosystem.
The old dunes. If a dune community could ever be called stable, this is such a community. Here we see that shrubs and trees have fully established themselves and myriad understory plants are thriving. Here on Lake Michigan, fires both past and present maintain these forests as open oak savannas.
As you can tell, the vegetation community has changed yet again. In fact, the dunes we're standing on now are many thousands of years older than what we saw closer to the beach. And here's one plant that's doing extremely well. This is the wild blue lupin, and it is a species very near and dear to my heart. Now, despite the fact that there's more organic layers in the soil, it is still nonetheless quite sandy around here, and plants living here have to deal with a lot of drought, hence the overstory is a lot of mixed oaks and hickories. But the lupins are especially good at growing in these poor sandy soils because they have a deep taproot. That taproot produces nodules that house special bacteria that can fix nitrogen and enrich the soil, which is to the benefit of many of the plant communities around here. Now, without fire to regularly clear out this area, these species get readily crowded out and shaded out, and they just don't do well with competition. Now, this species used to be widespread in eastern North America, but today it's fragmented into small pockets like what we see here along the shores of Lake Michigan. This is the sole larval food source for the Karner blue butterfly, and when this plant disappears, so does the butterfly. Hence, the Karner blue is considered an endangered species. Historically, lupin has gotten a bad rap, but today we're really starting to appreciate its role as an important component of this sandy ecosystem. So happy to see this plant doing so well here. We're standing here in a grove of jack pines, and their presence on this landscape is pretty fascinating. They're an echo of our glacial past, because they established here probably right after the Wisconsin Glacier retreated when the climate was a bit cooler, and they've persisted here ever since. Along with these jack pines, you also find bearberry, another northern species that does pretty well in these sand dune habitats right off the shores of Lake Michigan. It's a special moment to find them because, again, you'd have to go farther north, well into Canada, to actually see them again in any numbers. So given enough time, the process of succession, at least in this neck of the woods, leads to forests. And as you can see behind me, we've got a beautiful black oak savanna. These are some of the oldest dunes in the region, and they're a good representation of what historically a lot of the Great Lakes shorelines probably would have been in this area. The sandy soils hold enough organic matter, but nonetheless, we still have drought-tolerant species like these beautiful black oaks. Cherish these habitats. The ones that still remain need your help and they need your attention, because this is a dwindling ecosystem that, in the light of everything that has happened, we're lucky to still have a part of.
So, there are two processes produce the bare surface for colonization. Remember that to start a succession, there should be a bare ground, bare surface, okay, to start the succession from zero, okay? So, the two processes produce the bare surface for colonization include one slow and one rapid. I have prepared the information. Okay. Slow and rapid. 慢跟快. For slow process, there's a fall in lake level. As there's a lake, the water will move up and down, okay, like the waves. Okay, as I mentioned, this is a very big lake, look like a sea. Okay, there's a water move like waves, but this is caused by wind action. And the fall of the lake level will produce bare surface, okay, for the succession to start. And then there's a rapid process produce the bare surface, which is the movement of sand to form the new dune ridge from strong wind. Okay, so let's look at the formation of dune ridge of the sand dune. Okay, so this is the sand pile occur at the beginning. 一开始的时候，沙丘形成的时候都是一堆沙堆。This is sand pile， 只是一堆沙。Okay, with the wind action keep blowing in one direction, it form a structure like this. Okay, like a crescent structure， 看起来好像一个半月形，对不对？ And then as the tip of the dune keep on developing, it grow longer and longer and longer. It grow longer and longer, okay? And when it grow very long, it become very heavy. So it drop to the ground, okay? The sand drop to here, okay? And then there's new surface provide. And then as the wind keep on blowing, it keep on growing. When it become too heavy, it drop. Okay, so this keep on producing new surface for the plant to grow.
Clearly, two processes produce the bare surface for the colonization of plants on the dunes. First of all, the slow process, which is the slow process. This is the fall in the lake level, and it will produce the bare surface due to, for example, seasonal change of water level or evaporation of the water in the lakes. And then the rapid process, which is the movement of sand to form new dune ridge from strong wind. Okay, so this will produce the new surface on the dunes that are available for the plant colonization. Okay, let's look at what is the successional stage on this bare surfaces. And according to the scientific information, the succession of plants will start from the mirror grass, which is a pioneer surface, and it reproduced by vegetative propagation. So this is the early successional species. And then followed by shrubs like the willows and sand cherries and bunch grass. So there's a woody woody structure shrubs, and then followed by conifer pines, which is large trees, and which is more tolerant to low moisture because sand is not a favorable substrate for the growth of plant due to the unstable structure of the sands and the low water content. So conifer species, they usually can adapt to low soil water content, and the leaves, as the leaves are needle shapes, so it can successfully reduce the water loss due to evapotranspiration, and therefore conifer pines would be the very successful tree species, followed by the shrubs on successions. Okay, as the soil condition keep improving, okay, and then the broadleaf tree species can be start to colonize this type of soil environment. So followed by the cone species, the oak forest would be formed. And then finally, it will reach a more stable stage, which is colonized by the beech and maple forest. This is the later successional species. Okay, so I'm going to repeat this briefly in Mandarin. 我们要用中文简单讲一下哈，在我们要开始一个succession 的时候呢，首先有一个 bare surface， 这个光秃秃的表面呢，可以是因为两个过程而产生的。第一个是一个比较慢的过程，就是湖水的水平在下降，这是一个缓慢的过程，比如说是通过季节的变化导致的。好，也另外一个呢是一个比较快速的一个过程，就是在沙的移动的时候产生了新的沙丘的表面，好，因为风吹出一个弯曲的形状，产生一个新的光秃秃的表面。好，然后呢，我们在这个沙丘的演替呢，它植物的演替发生的过程呢，首先我们先锋的物种呢，会有这个 Miriam grass， 它是一个草本的植物，它是的繁殖呢是通过一个无性繁殖的方法啊，它是最早期就可以，它对于养分的需求是比较低的，所以它很适合生长在一开始水分比较缺少还有不稳定的沙质的一个底质里面。接下来呢就是灌木，灌木呢它是一个木本的植物，一个小的灌木，例如柳树或是我们叫 sanctuary 这一些branch grass。接下来呢，通过前面的植物慢慢的生长，还有它们的有机质去改善底质土质呢，那慢慢呢累积了一点点养分，还有土的保水能力有提升之后呢，那就会接下来有一些针叶树就会接下来的一个 stage。因为针叶树，比如说是松树之类的，它的对于土壤的低水分是可以比较忍耐的。另外，它们针形的叶子呢，就可以让它们减低水分的流失，通过 evapotranspiration。那所以呢，它们很适合在这种比较干旱的环境来成长。在土壤再进一步去改良之后呢，就可以有适合一些像橡树林去生长呢。那最后呢，到达一个比较稳定的土质，保水性质再进一步提升，土壤里面的有机质养分再提升之后呢，就可以得到一个比较后期的演替的状态，稳定的状态，就是我们的看到的最后的一个 beech maple 的 forest 的出现了。Okay, so from this successional change on the dunes environment, we can see the earlier plant actually can improve the soil quality by increasing the water content in the soil and the nutrient content, organic matter in the soil to improve the soil quality. So to facilitate later species, which is bigger trees, broadleaf trees, to colonize the latest successional environment. Okay, so for this later successional species, they will colonize only when the soil nutrient available. So this nutrient is provided by the earlier species, all earlier species of colonization, like I just mentioned for the miriam grasses, the willow, the shrubs. Okay, they can provide the organic content and nutrient to the soil. And the species composition and abundance approach an equilibrium controlled by the soil resource supply. This is very clear that we can see at the final stage, latest stage of succession on the dunes, in the more stable environment, we can find the broadleaf trees, like the beech, the maple species. But in this later stage of succession, it is actually constrained by the colonization event, limited by three factors. First, the chance arrival of seeds. Secondly, mortality due to water shortage. Third, mortality due to seed and seedling predation by herbivores. So these three factors are all important, but which one is more important? You need to think about this. Okay. Chance arrival of seeds. Seeds can arrive the dune surface by either, for example, the wind dispersal seeds arrive by the wind movement, or water dispersal seeds need the chance events to carry the seeds to the dune surface, or animal dispersed seeds, we need that chance that animal carry the seed and arrive the dune surface, the dune area. And secondly, if, as we know that the sand is not a good substrate to maintain high water content, so usually seed germination require high water content, and without water the seed cannot germinate, and then the survival of seedling would be limited. Okay, and even the seed can arrive at the dune surface, or the seed can germinate because of the sufficient water content in the soil substrates. They would be eaten, they would be predated by the herbivores, for example, the rats. Okay, so this loss of the factor could control the successful colonization of plants on the dune surface. So what is or are the limiting factor for the late successional species? How can we test this? Think about this. Okay, we have already learned the method to test this before. Do you still remember? Yes, of course, we can use transplant experiment. Okay, so I don't need to tell you again what is transplant experiment, because we already learned that before. So we can use transplant experiment to test each of the factor, which one would be the most important factor to control the plant's colonization event on the dunes. Okay, but I have to remind students that in different dunes environment, different factor could be more important than the other. So this vary case by case, vary from environment to environment, or from seasons to seasons, okay, or in different climatic environment. Okay, let's look at these two figures on your right hand side, so you would have a better understanding of the dune succession. So we can see as the dune's age increase, okay, for example here from 0 to 500 years, the percentage of cover of different plant species actually change. Okay, so at the beginning, in the earth for the young or earlier dunes, beach grass would be dominate, and then followed by the shrubs, as I just told you, and then as the soil content in quality improve with high water content and high nutrient content, then the conifer trees start to increase in their abundance. Okay, and as the soil quality keep improving with higher nutrient and organic matter, then the hardwood trees, which is the broadleaf forest, would become abundant at the later stage. Okay, and these hardwood trees or the broadleaf forest would be dominated by oaks. Okay, oaks, and then followed by what I just mentioned, the beech and maple. So early species, usually the grass, and then at the middle stage, usually the shrubs, and then followed by the pines, and then finally the broadleaf forest.
Later stage of the successional process at the Lake Michigan sand dunes. Okay, pine and oak tree will become the dominant species. Okay, if we look at the picture at the top part of the slide, you can see they are very different in the form and the shape of the seed for the pine tree and the oak trees. On your left hand side, you can see the seed of the pine tree. They are very small and very light. And for the right hand side, you can see the seed of the oak tree. They are relatively large and bigger in size, and you can see their reserve for oil, water, or starch in oak seed is much higher as compared to the pine seed. And they are primarily different in the weight. Okay, very clearly the difference between the two types of seeds would be would cause they are dispersed by different method. Pine tree, they are dispersed by wind, and oak seeds, they are dispersed by animal. Okay, and after the dispersal, the competitive trade between the pine seed and oak seed are also very different. So when we compare the two types of seed, although they emerge at the same time as other early successional species like the grass, as the soil at the early stage, they are very poor in nutrient and water. Both seeds cannot germinate at the early successional stage. Okay? For the seed germination or survival, they are highly related to water availability. And the seedling survival, they would associate with water, nutrient availability, and all the same time, mortality due to predation. Okay? 这些种子呢，种子的发芽跟存活一定会跟水分有关系，对不对？然后呢，种子发芽成幼苗的时候 ，seedling 的时候呢，它的存活呢，除了跟水分有关系以外呢，养分也是很必须的。还有呢，长成幼苗之后会不会被掠食者吃掉呢？这个掠食者主要是一些沙鼠，它们就会把这个种子吃掉了如果是这样子比较两种种子的话，到底哪一种是比较适合生长在沙丘环境后期、演替后期的沙丘环境呢？Okay, so in the latest stage succession, the competition for resources would be very important factor affecting the colonization species. So succession at the later stage, we can conclude that the trade-off between the colonization ability and the competitive trade would be very important. So we need to consider the colonization ability. Of course, the pine seed will be higher because there's high chance for them to reach the dunes. Okay, but for the competitive ability, of course, the oak seed will be higher because they reserve water and nutrient in the body for germination. Okay, but for the seedling predation, they should be similar between the two species. So which one would be more beneficial at the later successional stage? It would be the key factor affecting their colonization success.
For movie 5, this is a movie report about the primary successions of sand dunes, but this is not in the Great Lakes regions, but at other case in the southern England.
A warm spring day on the Dorset coast. This is Tudland Bay, a stretch of coastline to the west of Bournemouth. It looks very different now to the way it did 400 years ago, largely as a result of biological succession. This map of 1575 shows only a thin strip or peninsula of land. This was composed of sandy soil containing very little vegetation. Over the last 400 years, sand dunes have been building up along the eastern side of the peninsula. The dunes began growing from the south to the north, and at the same time another arm began growing southwards from the harbour entrance. These two arms of sand gradually overlapped, then joined together, cutting off a piece of Studland Bay and forming a lake in the middle. The original peninsula is now approximately 2 kilometres from the sea, and the land in between consists of 3 ridges with low-lying land between them covered with vegetation. All these changes have been brought about by biological succession. To understand the changes that have taken place over the past 400 years, one must start at the beach. The beach is composed of sand, which is washed up by the sea. Exposed headlands are being eroded by the waves and the weather, and the sand which results is washed onto the beach by water currents. Sand is a very unstable and unfavorable habitat for living organisms, but rotting seaweed on the beach forms a habitat and provides food for a few animals. Sandflies are one species which live in these conditions. This female sandfly is laying her eggs on the seaweed. When the tide is out, the sand dries, and if there is a wind from the sea, the sand is blown up the beach. Objects such as stones, shells, and things left behind by visitors cause eddy currents, and the sand piles up. This sand contains little humus but a lot of salt, conditions which most plants cannot tolerate. But some plants, whose leaves lose little water, actually thrive in dry, salty sand. Marram grass is one, and it grows very vigorously. As the plants grow, they trap more wind-blown sand and grow even more quickly, both up through the sand and towards the sea. Ridges of sand and marram grass can grow up to 50 feet high in ideal conditions. The marram grass has a vigorous system of roots and rhizomes which stabilizes and consolidates the sand, holding it in place against the wind. This is a rhizome, which allows the plant to reproduce vegetatively. When the marram grass has established itself, other plants start to colonize the sand dunes. This is lime grass. Even at this early stage, food chains are developing. Sand sedge starts to spread. These small rosette-like plants lie flat on the sand and help to stabilize it. Sea bindweed creeps across the sand, and all these plants provide habitats for some organisms. On these young and yellow sand dunes, conditions are still unfavorable to lots of species. But as the sand stabilizes, other plants invade the area and succession is underway. At this stage, the sand is still salty, with little humus, and nutrients are scarce. Drainage is very rapid, but as the sand rises above the water table, the salt is leached away. Now new species arrive, many blown in by the wind, and some find the acid conditions to their liking. Heathers and ling grow between the grasses and slowly force them out, and the area becomes a dune heathland. Many different lichens grow among the heathers. Mosses grow between the heather and the lichens. The dune heathland forms a habitat for insects and animals which form part of a food chain. As the plants are replaced by new growth, the old plants decay and form humus, which slowly leaches through the sand. As the humus increases, small trees begin to grow. The first ones are often pine trees. Gorse blows in the spring air alongside a sallow, a form of willow. And here, in the dune heathland, a rare bird, the Dartford warbler, builds its nest. A carrion beetle rests on a sallow leaf. Further from the shore, birch and pine trees have grown to a good height and shelter a sapling oak. In the damp areas between the dune ridges, royal ferns have rooted. A herbivorous beetle searches for food. Now the heathland slowly changes to woodland. In the woodland, mature birch, pine, and oak trees grow. Sweet-scented honeysuckle climbs up the trees and hoverflies float in the shade. The mature trees tower over the undergrowth growing out of the woodland floor of sphagnum moss and pennywort, which completely cover the soil. Space is in short supply. Mosses and lichens compete with one another. And rotting timber forms a habitat for the moisture-loving mosses. The humidity is much higher in the woodland than on the sand dunes. Because of this higher humidity, the vegetation is much richer and has formed a thick layer of humus with little or no trace of the original sand. Many species of insects, plants, birds, and animals exist in this small area reclaimed from the sea by biological succession. As the marram grass grows towards the sea, the dunes, the heathland, and the woodland, with their different organisms, inevitably follow. The coastline of this area of Dorset has been changing for hundreds of years. It is still changing and will continue to do so.
Movie 6. This is another interesting case study about the secondary successions of forest after the fire. We have mentioned the difference between primary and secondary succession in the lecture. This is the case studies about secondary succession, and which is very much different from what we learned about the primary succession for the case study after the volcanic eruption and the sand dunes case. So please watch this movie carefully. You are going to learn a lot.
Wildfire burned this area 2 weeks ago. This area burned 3 years ago by a fast-moving fire on a windy night. It's clear that the grasses were not killed by the blaze. Some of the broadleaf flowering plants became more abundant after the fire. The woody shrubs, such as sagebrush, did not fare so well. Many of the ponderosa pine were scorched, but most will survive and will recover. If we look closely, we can see the seedlings of shrubs beginning to recolonize the area. In a few years, the area will look much like it did before the fire. In this case, non-woody plants either survived the fire or reseeded it quickly from outside the area. They stabilize the place, protect it from erosion, and begin to rebuild the soil. Later, the woody plants take hold, achieving dominance over the pioneers that colonized the area after the fire. Eventually, the plant and animal community will resemble what was here before the fire. Nature's recovery from disturbances such as fire is an example of a process called secondary succession. If the disturbance is not too great, plants and the associated animals tend to replace themselves in a fairly predictable sequence, returning to a state similar to what was originally present. I'm Gene Gade of the University of Wyoming Cooperative Extension Service.
Students, if you are interested in the lecture content for the session, please read chapter 18 to 19 from our textbook, and you are encouraged to familiarize yourself with the key terms and the ecological concepts about succession. For our next lecture, we're going to talk about biodiversity, which is another important aspect for community structures and dynamic. We will also cover biodiversity conservation at the end of the lecture, which is a very important issue about how to protect and conserve our biodiversity for our globe. So let's take a break and then we will come back for the biodiversity lecture.